We're about ready to get started. So thank you all for being here. We have a great group here in New York and a pretty big group watching remotely as well. My name is Mike Corradini. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a senior planner in Vera Center on Immigration and Justice. We are at the Neil Weiner Research Speaker Series, and the series invites distinguished scholars and researchers to share their work on justice issues. It began under the leadership of the late Neil Weiner, a former senior fellow and research director at Vera, and following his passing, this series was named in his honor. So before I introduce our current speaker, I'd like to let you all know about our next speaker. On Wednesday, June 7th, we have Tracy Mears, from the law school, who will be talking about the fate of police reform in the new administration. But we'll see on the 7th. If you'd like to live tweet, we are doing that now. You can tweet along with us using hashtag VeraRSS, Research Speaker Series. So now, with that, I will get to introducing our speaker today. So today our speaker is Dr. Jonathan Kringen. I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Kringen over the past year or so on the issue of federal criminal prosecution of immigrants, with a specific focus on a program called Operation Streamline. And I want to take a minute to mention a few other people who have been working on this with us, my colleagues Laura Simic and Karen Berberick, and Jonathan's colleague Meredith Amy, who's here today, and Megan Soller as well as a few other researchers, probably plenty of researchers at the University of New Haven. So you'll learn a lot about Operation Streamline over the next hour or so, but for those of you who are already familiar with it, Operation Streamline is an immigration enforcement initiative that required the federal criminal prosecution of immigrants who enter the country without authorization, with an often repeated goal of deterring future unauthorized immigration. It's actually an issue that some of us here at Vera have been working on for several years now, but as with many things, that work became, I would say, more relevant and more certainly the 2016 election. So, we've seen and heard a lot about immigration enforcement over the past few months, and there's every indication that enforcement is ramping up. So, for example, ICE reported last week that arrested immigrants are up about 40% from a year ago. Perjuries of arrests at courthouses. Some cities have reported declines in immigrants reporting crimes committed against them out of fear that they'll be arrested. Sanctuary cities that limit their cooperation with ICE have been threatened with federal funding cuts. All to say nothing of this big, beautiful wall that apparently is going to appear on our southwest border at some point. Most importantly, though, for this discussion, we now have an Attorney General who said on a number of occasions, including in his confirmation hearing, that he believes Operation Streamline has succeeded in deterring illegal migration. And it will have what I would call Operation Streamline 2.0 starting up soon. So with that coming, and with all of these other things I've mentioned and any that I haven't, it's important to have Dr. Kringen's work on whether Operation Streamline has really had any sort of measurable, verifiable effect on deterring illegal migration. You can probably guess what the answer is, but I'm not going to give it away. I'm going to leave that for Dr. Kringen. I'll introduce Dr. Jonathan Kringen. And Dr. Kringen is an assistant professor in the Henry Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences at the University of New Haven. His teaching focuses on the quantitative applications in criminal justice. In addition to immigration, his primary interests include the application of advanced research methodologies, including computational and simulation approaches, to aid in the investigation of difficult to study phenomena. Kringen is no stranger to the board. He received his BA from the University of Texas Austin and his master's and PhD in criminal justice from Texas State University at San Marcos. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Kringen.
All right, thanks for the introduction. I'm Dr. Jonathan Kringen. I am the assistant professor and director of research at the Lee College in the University of New Haven. And I've been fortunate enough to work with individuals from Vera here over about the last year and a half, and we've been working with the Center on Immigration and Justice about some of the issues related to border enforcement policies, and we specifically took a look at this Operation Streamline. Like Mike indicated, Operation Streamline was a program whereby criminal prosecution for authorized entry became the default strategy. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to take a look at some of the things that we've looked at in terms of what Operation Streamline caused relative to deterrence, as well as looking at some of the systemic impacts, some of the things that it caused that were maybe unintended consequences. And so we'll jump right in. Basic start by understanding that deterrence as an idea is sort of the central tenet of U.S. border security, right? And deterrence is relatively well understood theoretically. It goes back many years, but deterrence is essentially the idea that individuals will make a choice. And by manipulating certain factors, you should be able to adjust the likelihood that they're going to make that choice. So it doesn't matter what the behavior is, but it's typically applied, it's like a real choice model to crime, right? Or offending. So if we take immigration, the idea that in making the choice to enter without authorization, you're going to weigh those factors, right? The cues in deterrence theory are that you're going to weigh the certainty being the likelihood that you would get a punishment. Your severity, which is how severe or how harsh that punishment is going to be, and celerity. And celerity is the idea of how soon you're going to receive the punishment. It's like time discounting. Perhaps I don't think I'm going to receive the punishment for a long time. I might go on ahead and take the risk, right? Aesthetically, altering these three things are believed to someone's decision, right? To a behavior such as unauthorized entry. One of the challenges with it is that deterrence pretty well from a behavioral standpoint. It's been studied for many years across many, many domains. And of the three factors, certainty, severity, and celerity, the only that's ever been shown consistently to have an impact is the certainty that you will in fact receive a punishment. It's never been the case that there's demonstrable evidence across a wide variety of domains that more serious punishments actually keep people from engaging in behavior. The problem we see theoretically with Operation Streamline is that they're increasing the certainty. They're increasing actual punishment, right? I mean, we can recognize that likely being incarcerated rather than being deported, right, is a severe form of punishment. So manipulating the severity, we theoretically, from what we understand about deterrence, what we understand from personal choice, that means the actual likelihood that someone would enter without authorization. If we think authorized entry, traditionally, it's been via deportation, right? And subsequently, you can actually restrict readmission. And these are sort of civil matters. So we would see this as a lower level penalty, right? A harsh sanction, if you will. And USC provides for both the deportation and prohibition of readmission, right? So when we look at the way this has been handled, it's been handled in a way that is similar in terms of the certainty of us receiving some type of punishment, right? But the punishment to be returned, right? To be deported. When we streamline, we see a fundamental shift. And what we see with Operation Streamline is the idea that came about in the early 2000s that what happened was a series of enhanced consequence delivery systems. You think about that, that's the phrase that's used. Enhanced consequence. It's not the enhanced likelihood, right? We said certainty matters, not severity. But focus here is on the severity, it's on the consequence, right? Now, under USC 1325, USC 1325, there's always been a charge where you can be charged for entry without inspection, unauthorized entry. And 1326 provides for unauthorized reentry, which is considered a more serious charge, right? Individual may have entered without authorization, they've been deported and then flagged, and then upon reentry, they've now actually violated the section that we talked about, which was the restriction against readmission within 5 years, right? But what happens with this, when we actually apply this particular sanction, we have to think about what happens, and not just to the individuals. I mean, very important, what happens to the actual individual who has entered the United States when they're actually prosecuted. But we also have to think about it as a systemic impact. We have to recognize that these individuals are booked and processed by the Marshal Service, right? We recognize that they're the Public Defender's Office, prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office, right? Adjudicated within federal courts, and ultimately they're imprisoned by the border prisons, right? Think about that as a systemic impact. We recognize that as we move in the direction of applying this sanction in attempt by the severity to reduce the behavior, we create a very large drain on the system. What we see is the argument that there is in fact a deterrent effect. And so I kind of show you, these are the data that are usually presented to demonstrate that this did in fact deter. And what these data show the number of apprehensions per year, right? The number of individuals apprehended within a year. And look at it, we see Streamline begins in 2005. There's a little asterisk on there because we're going to talk about that in a moment. And see is after it's implemented, we see where it looks falling off, right? And this picture tells a pretty good story, right? A pretty good story. It does seem to look like we have these high levels of apprehensions before Streamline happens. And then to show that we have these lower levels, much lower levels, in fact, after Streamline happens. If you look at that picture and you were to conclude that Operation Streamline did in fact deter, you would conclude exactly what that picture shows. That's what that looks like, right? It does very much look like less apprehension is occurring afterwards, implying fewer people are entering without authorization, right? The problem is that this is an inanalysis. In fact, it's an inappropriate analysis. We see over and over again the claim that this policy, Operation Streamline, the prosecution for unauthorized entry, has actually reduced the impact of what deterrence would do, right? We're measuring that by measuring the number of people apprehended, right? More generally, out of the individual program, it suggests the idea that criminalization can deter entry. Does that make sense? Right? The program itself tries to do this, but underlying this is this idea that if we criminalize this behavior, that in fact behavior will substantially reduce. That picture, and this is the same picture, it's just split over on the screen here a little bit. Look at that picture, it looks like deterrence. We see afterwards, we see this downward decline, we see this decline, we see this much lower level on average, but that it's an inappropriate form of analysis. It's not that we actually look at time series data to figure out whether or not something actually had an effect. And then we can kind of do to start showing this, we can just stretch it back a few years, right? So if we look at it going further back in the series, this is only going back about 20 years, right? Back much further, the picture becomes even more clear. Look at that. What I really see is that going back to 1992, it reached around 2000, right? The level of apprehension implying the largest number of individuals entering without authorization happening right around 2000, right? And look at the trends in this. That really there was this long-term increasing trend, and that's followed by a long-term decreasing trend. Now, if that peak and the turn downward actually happened right when Operation Streamline began, you'd have a relatively strong argument that it in fact deterred. But what we notice is that trends carry over long periods of time. And in fact, you can stretch the previous trend all the way back into the early 1970s, and it just continues to increase, right? Very long-term trend going up, just very long-term trend going down, and it doesn't correspond to when Streamline began, right? That's our first kind of indication that the argument that the lower level that we see here, that after this high level that we keep being shown, isn't a deterrent effect, right? But there's a lot more going on there. Really, Streamline did not occur in the entire U.S. It wasn't a national level policy, right? It really occurred in the southwestern border region, right? And look at the southwestern border region. We've got 9 sectors that make up border jurisdiction. We've got San Diego, El Centro, which are in Southern California. You've got Yuma, Tucson, which cover Arizona and a bit of Nevada. You've got Paso sector, which is actually New Mexico. And then you have 4 sectors that make up the state of Texas, right? This is the actual area where Operation Streamline happened. If you think about the picture we keep seeing, it's all apprehensions everywhere, right? Now, it's not as biased, it's not as far off as we might think, because in fact, the vast majority of Border Patrol apprehensions occur in the southern region, right? So but we still have a few questions there. A little bit more happens when we start to think about these sectors that becomes really important for understanding what happened with Operation Streamline. The first is that we keep talking about this implementation date of 2005. And Operation Streamline did not begin in 2005. It's only in the Del Rio sector in 2005. So when we look at that data and that line at 2005 and say, is it going on afterwards? We don't get to actually go down in the Del Rio sector, right? The only place it's actually happening. If we actually look at the rest of the sectors, what we see is that going to the east in Texas doesn't begin until 2007 in Laredo. It's in 2008 in Brownsville and 2010 in McAllen. Rio Grande Valley was previously two separate sectors. If we head to the east, we notice that, we'll notice the sector, Tucson is 2007, as is Yuma. So a lot of this implementation is happening much later in the series than that line even suggests. And if you think about that line being a downward trend, that means it's happening down the trend, right? Important, it's never actually implemented all in the California sectors. So an analytic question of saying, does that picture mean anything? It doesn't actually tell us when Operation Streamline began. So working with Vera here, we've been exploring this issue. And what we, back to the, looking at the peak that happens around the year 2000, right? I point, it's the result of this long upward trend, followed by this long downward trend. And this turns out is implementation date for Del Rio. Now, to kind of context, help you understand how important that is as part of the consideration in time. Del Rio accounted for 7.2% of all apprehensions in the Western region. So where's the date that this started, that some people are applying this downward trend to? Only 7.2% of the individuals engaged in unauthorized entry. We slide to 2007, and at that point we have Yuma, Tucson, and Laredo, right? Large percentages, right? In the Tucson sector. Since that this is actually 2007, a more likely candidate about when we might expect there to be a deterrent effect, if in fact we were going to see one. But the trend's been going down for quite a while, right? Followed through El Paso and Brownsville in 2008, and up with the McAllen sector of Rio Grande Valley in 2010. But this is kind of key standing this from a data analysis standpoint, right? By the implementation occurs, where the majority of apprehensions are occurring, the apprehensions are already at 20-year lows. That, what we see is in series data what we kind of call regression to the mean. It's very normal that things go up and things come. There are a number of social reasons for that phenomenon, but this returning to a very common level, and data series further back actually see that this is an average level across the previous 35 years. Right? At this point, it becomes very difficult to see the deterrent effects happening. It looks much more like this long-term downward trend is occurring, and through it, we kind of implemented Operation Streamline in most of the areas. Right? So the question, Operation Streamline deter, and this was the sort of first half of what we worked on. The answer, probably not. And what I've done here just to demonstrate this is we've broken it down, right? The data look a little different because these are monthly data. It helps us actually analyze patterns a little bit better. But we'll see if you look at a sector by sector basis, looking at actual implementation dates within each sector. For all sectors, Laredo, Tucson, El Paso, and Del Rio, you see these long-term trends that occurred long before the actual program began. The period of high volatility actually returns to levels that we had seen previously. And in some sector, you actually see a market increase after, right, Streamline began. So if we look at a sector by sector analysis, we don't see any signs of evidence, right? Now, criticism that I have is that a number of people have shown us these graphs, not broken down in this way, but the generic graphs, they've stretched it out longer. They said, pull it back and let's show that the levels post-Streamline are as low as levels pre-Streamline in the late 80s, right? to really a deterrent effect, you need to turn to a statistical analysis, right? And what we report is that there is no statistical evidence of deterrence. So applying series models that are appropriate for these type of data, bivariate arena interrupted time series, right, where we take and understand the underlying seasonal patterns, the underlying long-term trends, ask the question, did the policy actually change it once we recognize those trends? We find none of these sections any actual evidence that there was a deterrent effect. So, but only we find no statistical evidence thereof either. That we find no evidence of a deterrent effect. So let's turn to the discussion a little bit, right? In the case that had we found a deterrent effect, or if there was a deterrent effect, you can engage in a discussion of relative value, right? A discussion of the impact of this, but a deterrent effect that you may find a value in, right? We find that when there is no deterrent effect. And as to the question, what are the impacts? What are the costs? And while there are many, right, and there are a few different categories of costs that people have written about, we're a systemic impact on courts and in prosecutions. We look at prosecutions because in some way it encapsulates the element of being prosecuted, right? It gives us a sense of the number of individuals and what they're experiencing. As well, it gives us a sense of the systemic impact on federal courts. Trends in prosecution, right? We're looking at unauthorized entry prosecutions, and these are generically Section 1325 and Section 1326, right? 1325 again is the section that prosecutes for first-time unauthorized entry. 1326 is for reentry. Now, looking at the data, what we're looking at here is we're looking at what a case was filed as, and then that we include 1326 charges, right? The reentry charges, is many of them are later adjudicated as 1325 charges, right? Either way, we're using authorized entry or unauthorized reentry as something that I might refer to as a petty immigration charge, right? It's a substantive charge related to some other type of activity. It means that what you are fundamentally being charged with is being here without authorization. Make sense? And then since 1997, we see this huge increase, right? See this low 7,000-ish, right? Prosecutions. And we think about that, that's a 448% increase. A 448% increase over roughly 20 years. Remember, period, apprehensions are dropping, right? But going to, right, where most of this is occurring, going back to the region and looking at the states and thinking about the actions that make up these states, right? We can and understand likely the impact here would be much higher. And there's a bit involved. First thing we have to do is we have to remember that California didn't actually engage in Operation Streamline. We've also removed Big Bend from this analysis because there's conflicting information about the actual date in which Streamline supposedly began, right? A little bit as well about what that means, Operation Streamline beginning, looking at some of this. So I'm focusing at this point on the remaining 6 sectors. Now, the districts on that, you end up, of course, the courts in the California district, the courts in Arizona, New Mexico. You have the, right, so we have the Arizona courts, for example. The Arizona courts and take a look at them. But we not the number increasing, but the systemic impact of the percent of cases, what I'd call petty immigration cases. And what very clearly, again, you have about 18% in 1997. That's coming out at almost half. Again, 100% increase. Mexico, we see that similar, right, with a large actual net effect. We see the percent of cases early on are actually petty immigration, right? %. We see a very large trend, right? 15%. If we move to the southern district, Texas, peaking out at almost 1%. that, think about what's happening in federal courts, right? And so the argument is that you can process so many cases, right? Not being processed in these regions because we're processing these immigrant cases. Now, there is evidence that suggests that the reason these percents have gone so high is because of the number of en masse proceedings that are happening, right? The number of cases where prosecutions are occurring for a large number of individuals at the same time with virtually no due process. There's documentation available on that. But I want what this means in the context of some of the underlying arguments that are commonly used to support the idea that immigration itself is fundamentally criminal, right? And the surrounding immigration and crime is kind of a key example of rhetoric that we find no scientific basis for, right? Very importantly, and the argument about in support of various immigrant policies, right? The argument that immigrant criminogenic, right, comes up with some regularity. There's no report for that in the literature, right? In fact, there's a lot of empirical support that goes to the contrary, which suggests that first-generation immigrants actually exhibit lower levels of criminal behavior than residents. We are in the context of these specific cases, right? And the way this is we're saying, I want to understand of those immigration prosecutions, those ones are happening in the New Mexico district at 70%, right? Happening in Arizona at roughly 50%. When I want to understand, was that actually the most serious charge, right? I mean, it's possible that some people are charged with immigration as a lesser included, right? With immigration because you maybe have been picked up, engaged in what I'd call a serious immigration offense, like a human trafficking. You may to a drug offense. You may have been picked up related to a firearms offense, right? The types of behaviors that would in fact support the rhetoric that enforcement is necessary because of the criminogenic nature of immigration. High 90s. We see Arizona sector. Of all prosecutions that are occurring, unauthorized reentry is the highest charge, right? It's the biggest thing that an individual has done. And a little bit further, this becomes a little more clear, it becomes a little more salient what this means, gives us a strong sense. In most cases, it's the only charge. Fast that we're preparing, we're working on a little bit of additional data, but our preliminary analysis shows that these numbers as well showing up, which suggests that earlier on in immigration enforcement, right, or prosecution, very funny is immigration was included as a lesser included charge relative to some other offense. As we see this increase arriving at these levels to show us that the transition is in the direction of itself being viewed as fundamentally criminal and prosecuted as fundamentally criminal with other factors whatsoever. Now, I think that was actually an artifact of Operation Streamline, right? If we start a policy that says what we're going to do is we're going to start criminally prosecuting immigration, we would expect to see increases in those times, right? Important because we've talked about Operation Streamline and there have been protests about Operation Streamline. But in the data, it doesn't bear criminal penalties for unauthorized entry or reentry is the only charge. Prosecutions where it's the most serious charge, meaning some other minor violation. Those since long before Operation Streamline occurred. In fact, the key to these numbers, I don't see the fact of having implemented Operation Streamline. In fact, it appears so that Operation Streamline is somewhat of an artifact of a toward criminalization of immigration that's been going for a much longer period. What does this mean? What does all come together and mean? What means to me is that we see that in criminal prosecution for unauthorized entry, it's not deterring. Right? It's not actually reducing the number of individuals who are in authorization, right? And the argument that all of the effects, the human effects, the systemic effects, the environment merge turns on whether or not it actually effectively reduces the behavior. See again and again it doesn't. That's consistent with our theoretical understanding of deterrence. Right? Theoretically have expected it to, and it turns out the data shows that it doesn't. Right? We see this marked increase in the number of prosecutions where over 70% of the cases are immigration. Right? We question the nature of that relative to other immigration-related offenses that are more serious, such as human trafficking. Right? There's some suggestion, right, which we'll delve into a little further. There's some suggestion that's been shown empirically that other types of prosecutions have gone down as these prosecutions have gone up. Right? Occurring despite the fact these individuals, the individuals who are being prosecuted for immigration, for any other criminal activity, we have evidence actually engaged in other than the president of the United States. So as we I about what do I think that this means? Like what do I think that this suggests? And in some ways, this analysis was historical. Right? Operation Streamline began in 2005, right? So looking back to see what happened when this policy went into place. An anecdote, right? Just to me, the idea that why Operation Streamline happened, right? The criminal activity, immigration, and as clearly bears out the trends in prosecution that start before Operation Streamline, that could be viewed as reactionary, right? And if there's a central tenet of policy analysis, it's the reactionary policy tends to be bad policy, right? Operation Streamline, a policy from the standpoint of the impact on courts, right? If a single factor, we say we simply want courts to be more efficient, we want them to be prosecute more serious offenses in federal court, operate from that, right? It's very obvious in the data, right? See this issue where a policy that was entered into in a reactionary manner, right, handed consequences that affected safety issues, right, more serious safety issues. On an argument about criminal behavior in immigrants that's never been empirically supported, right? Again, in our data, right? We see it again in our data that there's that these specific individuals, not generally speaking, but these specific individuals who are prosecuted. I have to take from this is the idea that forward in immigration policy, right? We really concentrate on the nature in which it's reactionary, right? The nature in which it's driven by rhetoric as opposed to evidence, the nature in which policies are implemented, not evaluated, and perhaps the way in which inadequate evaluation can be and can gate policies. Yeah.
You did any analysis. I'm wondering if you did any analysis of the patterns in San Diego or Central, I mean, the Southern District, California, because when Carol Lam was fired by the Bush administration, claimed it was because she had not instituted Operation Streamline, which of course she had not, and her successors did not either. So it strikes me that patterns in that sector might also shed light on the pattern in the other sector.
Yeah, in fact, we did. We've explored Southern California districts as well as the apprehensions within the region, the jurisdictions in California. And what you see is it's a good example of a counterfactual, right? We have an area where the policy didn't happen, and so and we see this regularly that policy is implemented and perhaps something goes down thereafter. The argument that, well, that's got to be deterrence because clearly it would have been higher otherwise, right? Well, the sectors serve as actually a very good counterfactual of that because the patterns mirror almost identically what happened everywhere else, right? Which is suggestive of a number of, other factors, right? You have, now early in the process, we conducted a thorough systematic review of immigration, And so we did about 6 months of review with the idea of trying to understand what are the sort of key push and pull and enabling factors that really drive aggregated immigration, macro level immigrants. And we ultimately, we pursued some data. The challenge is that a number of the sort of push factor data side, the information about maybe economic conditions in countries of origins and of that really kind of aren't available. So what you have is a situation where you have to look at the data under a technique that kind of works. Actually, the California districts were fascinating for this because, in fact, the other that comes up from time to time would be an argument which would state that, oh, it doesn't matter because, because in Del Rio in 2005, Operation Streamline began, and see everyone knew this, and then quickly elsewhere, and that's why the trend started there, right? The other that you see in time series analysis that's fascinating is that the threat to validity, the big thing that could throw it all off, is that something else happened that you didn't measure, right? If you the dates started to downturn and you begin to compare them to things like economic conditions in the U.S., availability of jobs, actual wages. If you compare them to Mexican wages, which we've also done, you see certain key indicators. And you can look at the percentage of country of origin year by year to get a sense of how you should weight these factors, which that you kind of capture all of that simply by looking at California. Right? So it's very important that we do that. We didn't present it in the list there, but we absolutely.
Deportation. But when that sign, the one sign, and there's no way. Deport them. How do we wonder if they're not a terrorist? What's them? Looks like the living America, like James Brown. Fix victims. And we need laws for immigrants because they have rights too. Right? They may be immigrants, but they're not slaves. Left the window years ago. Including white slavery. People forgot that part.
As I was putting the presentation together and I was looking at various imagery to kind of presentation to bring home some of the points. I focused on that particular sign because that particular sign boldly declares this behavior alone is criminal, right? It's indication of a fundamental attitude toward immigration, right? So interestingly, there's definitely the policy question about what should immigration policies look like. On the other hand, it's fascinating to see it for an icon, right, on the side of the road that very specifically declares this isn't about deportation, this is about the likelihood you can be actually incarcerated.
Thank you, presentation. It's fascinating. My question, I guess, the rationale behind Operation Streamline, but also the rationale behind the time series analysis, kind of both, and it makes sense, rest on the assumption that there is this kind of perfect and logical understanding of the operation south of the border, and that people understand what Operation Streamline is, and that when it's implemented in Del Rio, it's just in that region and not in other regions. I'm just wondering if there's been any quantitative research into the bit of information that is kind of shared and spread and knowledge south of the border about, and also how it was implemented.
So what's fascinating is that one of our initial objectives in the project with Vera was exploring this issue to sort of understand what the missing pieces in the understanding of this type of policy would be, right? And one of the things that engage in a discussion about would be that as a type of follow-up research that would be very important. It would be exactly that understanding, because it does go back to our theoretical understanding of deterrence, right? Long understood that we talk about deterrence related to objective properties of things, saying this is a law and this is a penalty. Behavioral, and it happens within the individual calculation. It's perceptual. Right? To what extent does anyone understand that this is actually enforced? To what extent do they understand what the actual punishment would mean? Right, and that part of it is absolutely fascinating. Is the idea that is the argument of that the California counterfactual is actually very helpful with. The assertion is that it began in Del Rio, so everyone knows, and because everyone knows, that's why it started elsewhere, roughly really a few years before, but roughly the same date. And it goes back to your question: how does that information disseminate, and to what level are individuals who might be engaged in this consideration actually cognizant, or that there could be a penalty? The other side of it, and this is part of the challenge of understanding any deterrent effect, the side is a weighting mechanism, right? Rational calculus is a way of saying risk versus reward. You, at an individual level, have to find out what are the circumstances that an individual might be leaving, what are the perceived circumstance to which they might arrive, and in that case, they may be actually perceptually very aware of the threat, right? Actually be perceptually very aware of the potential punishment, and yet the decision would still be to end without authorization. So understanding how that happens, particularly in the dynamic of in the sense of border dynamics, right, where we go on the southern border, for example, once crossed, we know there's been a long-term transition to individuals from Central America. That is stage 1 of immigration is to make it to the northern border of Mexico. Stage 2 of immigration is then to actually get into the U.S., where you actually have an entirely different developing culture, if you will, related to that. And so it's actually fascinating. On the side of it, which I'd be happy to discuss offline, since it gets kind of technical and kind of moves in a different direction, is the analysis. And so these types of things happen, and turns out, at an aggregate level over time in somewhat predictable patterns. And so our ability to look within the data, and it's what our models actually do, they let us kind of control for or take out these kind of seasonal patterns, these kind of short-term trends, and that's really what the statistical modeling is about.
So thank you for a very compelling presentation. Could you comment on where no evidence of deterrence is the same as statistical evidence that there is no deterrence? And if it's different, how to relate and how one would deal with somebody who said, well, okay, you didn't find statistical evidence of deterrence, but maybe did find that there's statistical evidence that there's no deterrence.
Right. That's an excellent question. It has to do with, it actually is a issue that's well established in the scientific community about how we actually analyze data. And there are really two camps, fascinating history of the agreement between mathematicians. But there are two camps in the way that it's viewed. One camp looks at it very much and says, evidence of no effect is not evidence that there is really no effect. It's just we can't say there is an effect. Another camp very clearly interprets it by saying this is evidence that there is no effect. And that's all there is to it. This becomes a philosophical question at a certain point. My on it is that the null is what we should believe. I think of statistical testing as how should you think about things? What should you believe outside of a demonstration otherwise? In a policy, particularly a policy that has costs and systemic impacts, human impacts, a safe position, so we can merge the science with value, is that you probably shouldn't do things that have huge costs and can demonstrate evidence that actually accomplishes what you're trying to accomplish. And so I would say that my position is more centrist in that I believe there is no deterrent effect. Analysis of the data suggests to me that there is no deterrent effect, and that the policy did not change the actual number of individuals or likely the individual calculations in terms of I enter without authorization. I that for individuals who take a different approach to statistics, who might say there being no evidence of an effect, these people might still say they're uncomfortable saying no effect whatsoever. The question, what do you do without evidence in the light of an implementation? And I would say the answer to both philosophical positions in terms of the outcome is the same. Should be incarcerating, should be prosecuting, should be conducting, creating this systemic impact, should you be diverting resources from other more important issues, if we have no evidence that this actually works. In analyzing these type of data, and the process for this is really quite robust in terms of the numbers of ways that we would go through it. Find in looking at these data is that I conclude that this means there is no deterrent effect. Right. So to me, to my interpretation of this, I feel comfortable saying this did not deter. I think they both lead to the same place. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
I was, as I'm sure many of us were, struck by the massive increases in proportion of prosecutions that are for immigration offenses. And I thought about John Pfaff's work on the incentive structures around prosecutors and how they charge and how that contributes to mass incarceration. I'm wondering if you could speak to how you think the incentive structures are put in for federal prosecutors, particularly since they're not elected. Do you see this as simply a top-down policy issue, or are there cultural issues? Are there other kinds of incentives that you would look for if you were looking to kind of study that side of things?
Yeah, I would first begin by saying this would be speculation. It's sort of the summary of materials that I've read. It's not empirically based. But my is that it, in as much as there was a top-down push, is that in some ways this is a cultural phenomenon. You might actually look more generally at them up and the push toward criminalization. So in as much as the initiatives themselves are pushed down, we also see publicly, right? We have individuals very clearly on the side of abolishing these types of policies, on not continuing these types of prosecutions. We have individuals on the side that very clearly push that this is the right thing to do. So there is actually an effect coming from the bottom as well. So based on the writings on prevalence of both of these sort of factors, I would say in all likelihood it's probably a sort of a cultural merge in the middle. I think that I can't comment at a systems level on what the specific incentives and how this would play out. It's another one of the areas that we explored as we looked into data analysis. We said a lot of what we were trying to accomplish would be to isolate some of the other things that we really think are key to understanding missing our modeling of policies related to immigration, and similarly understanding how these types of information how this type of information would disseminate among individuals for whom it would be relevant. Another one of the key questions that we came up with was a matter of understanding within the court system itself, how does this function? Now, there is evidence available on the sort of en masse processes, on severe due process issues, and those things are available for review. One very fascinating question to me personally is but how did that occurring at an aggregate level relate to the individual decision process? It's an excellent question. So.
Operation Streamline is driven or facilitated by the financial interests of the legal system, the court system, the prison system.
And again, this comes from our background reading on the material rather than an empirical analysis. Yet it's one that really should be conducted at some point. There's a clear outcome from Operation Streamline, which is a substantially larger number of individuals prosecuted, of which the vast majority take a guilty plea, right? And those individuals go into incarceration. Now, we one of the things that we would like to be able to do in a follow-up would be to link this to some of the prison data, right? So we can look at actual transfers, so we can see specifically are these individuals going, right? There's reports available that do characterize Operation Streamline as being related to the prison pipeline, and there's one in particular that relates it to privatization as well. And so avenues are areas that really should be followed up on. We would have to ask, I think, a very relevant question is to what extent does Operation Streamline do that? But to what extent is that a reflection of it mirroring an overall system, right? That's, whether it's sort of particular to Operation Streamline or whether it's a systemic problem that manifests within Operation Streamline, that would be important. Good question.
Hi. I'm wondering when you guys were looking at the push and pull factors of immigration, so from the economic conditions in the countries of origin and also maybe the economic recession in the U.S., if you were able to look at how increased enforcement has perhaps encouraged immigrants to stay in the U.S. versus, in previous decades when there was more porousness of the border and like more fluidity of movement of immigrants.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a very good question. We don't have available data on that, and it's something that it falls into a series of questions that we sort of thought-stormed about in terms of what all happens as a result of this. Something that thought that a viable methodology for that would be to conduct some interviews kind of within unauthorized communities that contain a sufficient number of unauthorized individuals. And so it's a very good question. The only actual thing I can empirically is a slide that I showed that showed the number of prosecutions for unauthorized entry skyrocketing. And I showed the arrow indicating, but this is actually as apprehensions are going down. Now, if we that apprehensions give us a relatively strong sense of the number of individuals here entering the country. It's a proportional measure, right? But it gives us a sense that if apprehensions are going down, entries are going down. If entries are going down and prosecutions are going up, that does suggest that there's something a little bit different in the dynamics of what's happening with individuals' time within the U.S. Kristen.
It's really excellent work and presentation. Was there in or around 2005 an overall increase in detention if you combine both the criminal systems and the immigration systems? And is that an explanation that you have to refute? So I'm imagining if you're in a country of origin and the story come back to you is folks are being locked up at a much higher rate, never mind whether they're criminally prosecuted or in the immigration detention system. And I suppose related to that is, does the criminal prosecution give the authorities ways to keep you locked up longer than just awaiting your immigration court hearing?
It's a good question. If I understand it correctly, it's a good question regardless. But if I understand it correctly, So and this goes into that area. It does follow into what we want to be able to follow up with, to be able to comment on empirically, which has to do with the follow-up of this. So we see the prosecutions, right? We have some information basically on sentencing, but following through with that to understand, it is very important to understand what's actually happening with these people once they're actually in. They're inflicting pieces of anecdotal evidence about sort of what the duration is once you've actually been incarcerated under a charge, right? I've read a little speculation that it's about, and this actually reflects kind of an earlier policy, which is about getting a criminal conviction on record. That provides for harsher sanctions upon a subsequent reentry, so that perhaps the actual utility of this is that now having been federally prosecuted and adjudicated, found guilty, that then this is actually on an individual's record. So perhaps the tenure, the time spent incarcerated becomes less important because that serves a systemic goal or a systematic goal of having another way in which to prosecute these individuals once they've actually returned, right? Because now they're not just unauthorized entry, right? So, but it's something that we would like to follow up with in terms of understanding the relationship of incarceration related to criminalization of unauthorized entry and place in the context of the overall trends in incarceration, right? There are a number of reports that have looked at it on a limited scale, but it's something I think that needs to be explored much further.
I had a question about osteoarthritis.
Yep, sure.
Thanks very much.
Thank you much.